It was January of 2024. The air in rural Vermont wasn't just cold, it was aggressive. It was the kind of cold that found the smallest gap in your jacket and bit down until your skin turned a dull shade of blue. For Tom and Sarah Miller, however, this was exactly what they had asked for. Before we begin, tell me where you were watching from in the comments. They had spent 15 years in the chaotic, gray concrete jungle of Chicago. Tom was a high-level software consultant, and Sarah was a freelance illustrator. They were tired. Tired of the sirens, tired of the traffic, and tired of the feeling that they were just two more ants in a massive hill. So, they bought a house. But not just any house. They bought a 100-year-old colonial estate sitting on 40 acres of dense pine forest just outside a tiny town called Bennington. They moved in on the 1st of January. By the 3rd of January, the first blizzard hit. It dumped 2 feet of snow over the property, turning their driveway into a white canyon. They were isolated, but they loved it. They had a massive fireplace, enough firewood to last 3 months, and a pantry full of supplies. They felt safe. But in the world of the strange, dark, and mysterious, feeling safe is usually the first sign that something is terribly wrong. The first guest. On the morning of January 5th, Tom woke up early to make coffee. As the machine hissed in the kitchen, he looked out the large bay window that faced the front yard. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, casting long, blue shadows across the pristine snow. That's when he saw it. Standing exactly 10 feet from their front porch was a snowman. It was a perfect, classic snowman. 3 spheres of packed snow, a carrot for a nose, and 2 charcoal eyes. It was about 5 feet tall. Tom chuckled to himself. He figured Sarah must have gone out late at night or very early in the morning to surprise him. She was artistic, after all. But when Sarah came downstairs 20 minutes later, wrapped in a thick wool robe, he thanked her for the new neighbor. Sarah looked at him, confused. "What neighbor, Tom?" "The snowman, Sarah. It's a nice touch." Sarah walked to the window and paled. "Tom, I didn't build that. I've been asleep since 10 o'clock last night. I haven't even put my boots on yet." Tom felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. He put on his heavy coat and stepped outside. He walked around the snowman, looking for footprints. In Vermont, if you walk through 2 feet of fresh powder, you leave a trail that looks like a trench. But as Tom circled the snowman, his heart began to thud against his ribs. The snow around the snowman was perfectly smooth. There were no footprints leading to it. There were no footprints leading away from it. It was as if the snowman had simply materialized out of the freezing air. The mimicry. The next 3 days were quiet, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The silence of the woods, which had once felt peaceful, now felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. On the morning of January 9th, Tom opened the front door to get the mail. He froze. There were now 3 snowmen. They were standing in a semicircle, all of them facing the house. But these weren't just random snowmen. One was tall and broad, wearing an old baseball cap that Tom realized with a jolt of terror was his favorite Chicago Cubs hat, a hat that he had left on the mudroom bench inside the house the night before. The second snowman was slightly shorter and held a set of wooden knitting needles in its snow-clumped hands. Sarah had been looking for those needles for 2 days. The third snowman was small, maybe 3 feet tall. It was holding a stuffed teddy bear. Tom slammed the door and locked it. He ran to the living room where Sarah was sitting. "Sarah, check the nursery, now!" They burst into their daughter Lily's room. Lily was only 4 years old and was peacefully playing with her blocks. But when Sarah looked at the bed, her breath hitched. Lily's favorite teddy bear, the one she had slept with every night for 2 years, was gone. Tom grabbed his phone. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He dialed 911. 911. "What is your emergency?" the operator asked. "Yes, my name is Tom Miller. I'm at 425 Hollow Road. Someone is on my property. They've been inside my house. They're building things in the yard." "Sir, take a deep breath," the operator said. "Are you in immediate danger?" "I don't know. They took my hat, my wife's needles, and my daughter's bear. And they're using them to dress up snowmen in our front yard." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sir, I will dispatch a deputy to your location, but with the current road conditions, it might take 1 to 2 hours. Please ensure all your doors are locked. The whiteout. The deputy never arrived. A massive nor'easter storm moved in faster than the weather reports had predicted. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wind was howling at 50 miles per hour. The visibility was zero. It was a total whiteout. The power flickered. Once, twice, and then died. The house plunged into darkness. Tom and Sarah huddled in the living room by the fire. They had moved Lily's mattress into the room with them. Tom held a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He sat in a chair facing the hallway that led to the kitchen and the basement. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind died down for a brief moment. In that sudden, vacuum-like silence, they heard it. Thump! It came from below them. The basement. Thump! Shrek! Shrek! It sounded like something heavy and wet being dragged across the floorboards. Tom stood up, his knuckles white around the iron poker. He turned on his heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam toward the basement door. The door was ajar. Tom knew for a fact he had bolted that door with a heavy brass latch. He walked forward, every step feeling like he was moving through chest-deep water. He reached the door and pushed it open. The air coming up from the basement was even colder than the outside air. It smelled like damp earth and something sweet, like rotting apples. He shone the light down the stairs. At the bottom of the steps, there was a pile of snow. But it wasn't just a pile. It was shaped. It was the base of another snowman. Tom's heart was racing at 120 beats per minute. He shouted into the darkness, "I have a weapon! Get out of my house!" No answer. Only the sound of the wind picking up again outside. He descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The basement was a labyrinth of old stone foundations and wooden support beams. He reached the bottom and looked at the snow structure. It was half finished. But as he panned the light around the room, the beam hit the far corner near the old coal chute. The coal chute was a small metal door, about 2 feet wide, that led to the outside. It was hanging wide open. Snow was blowing in, dusting the floor. And there, sitting on a crate next to the chute, was a small battery-operated tape recorder. It was Tom's recorder, the one he used for work memos. Tom reached out a trembling hand and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, the sound of rhythmic breathing. And then, a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like 2 pieces of ice rubbing together, raspy, cold, and hollow. 14, the voice whispered. 13. 12. It was a countdown. The ring of sentinels. Tom scrambled back up the stairs, locked the basement door, though he knew the lock meant nothing now, and ran to the living room. He grabbed Sarah and Lily. "We're leaving. Now, I don't care about the storm. We're getting in the truck." They threw on their heaviest parkas and boots. Tom grabbed his truck keys. They burst out the front door into the screaming wind. Tom fumbled with the key fob, hitting the unlock button. The headlights of his heavy-duty pickup truck flashed, cutting through the swirling white abyss of the storm. What the lights revealed made Sarah scream a sound that Tom would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The truck was gone. Not stolen. It was buried. But it wasn't buried by the storm. Surrounding the truck and stretching in a perfect, unbroken circle all the way around the house were snowmen. 40, 50, 60 of them. They were all standing shoulder to shoulder, their snow arms interlocked. They were all facing the house. And every single one of them was wearing something from the house. There was a snowman wearing Sarah's favorite blue dress. Another was draped in the curtains from the dining room. One had Tom's silver watch pressed into its chest. One was wearing Lily's tiny yellow rain boots. It was a wall of white, frozen, silent watchers. They had been trapped. Tom tried to run toward the circle to break through, but as he stepped into the snow, he felt his foot hit something hard beneath the surface. He brushed the snow away. It wasn't a rock. It was a human hand. Frozen solid. Tom pulled back, falling into the snow. He realized then that the strange part of this mystery was far darker than a prank. He began to dig frantically near the base of the nearest snowman. Beneath the snow, tucked into a crawlspace vent that led under the house, he found a small, hollowed-out nest made of insulation and stolen blankets. There were wrappers from their pantry. There were photos of them sleeping, taken from the foot of their bed. The midnight snowman wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a man. A man who had been living in the crawlspace of that house for 3 weeks. He was a local drifter who had gone missing in the woods 10 years ago, a man the town had forgotten. He had gone mad in the isolation of the Vermont winters. He didn't want to kill them, not at first. He wanted to collect them. He wanted to turn them into part of his family. The aftermath. Tom managed to get Sarah and Lily back inside and barricaded the bedroom door. He spent the rest of the night sitting against that door with the iron poker, watching the sun slowly rise through the frost-covered glass. When the sun finally came up on January 10th, the wind stopped. The silence returned. Tom looked out the window. The circle of snowmen was still there. But they were different now. In the morning light, he could see that they were melting slightly, their features drooping, making them look like they were weeping. The deputy finally arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning. When he saw the yard, he called for backup immediately. He told Tom he had never seen anything like it in 25 years of law enforcement. The police searched the crawlspace. They found the nest, they found the collection of items, but they never found the man. The only thing they found was a trail of bare footprints, human footprints, leading away from the coal chute straight into the deep, dark woods of the Green Mountains. The Millers left that house on January 11th, but he never went back. They sold the property at a massive loss and moved back to a bright, noisy, crowded apartment in the city. Because for Tom and Sarah, the sound of a siren or a honking car was much better than the sound of srek, srek, srek in the middle of a Vermont night. To this day, the locals in Bennington tell stories about the Snowman of Hollow Road. They say that if you move into an old house in the woods, you should always check the crawlspace before the first snow falls. Because once the snow arrives, you might find that you aren't the only one living there. And if you wake up and see a snowman in your yard that you didn't build, don't wait for the countdown to reach 0. Today's story is about a mistake so small, so simple, and yet so catastrophic that it haunts the history of the Alaskan wilderness to this day. It is a story about how a single gesture, a movement of the hand that took less than 3 seconds, sealed a man's fate in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. To understand the gravity of this tragedy, we first have to look at the setting. We are going to the Brooks Range in Alaska. This is not the Alaska of cruise ships and tourist gift shops. This is the deep bush. It is a place of jagged, snow-capped peaks, endless valleys of tundra, and rivers that freeze so solid you can drive a truck over them. It is a place where the sun refuses to set in the summer and refuses to rise in the winter. It is a landscape that is indifferent to human life. It does not care if you are hungry, it does not care if you are cold, and it certainly does not care if you made a clerical error. In 1981, a man named Carl McCunn decided he was going to conquer this landscape not with a gun, but with a camera. Carl McCunn was 35 years old. He was a wildlife photographer, but he was also a bit of a drifter, a rock and roll fan, and a guy who everyone seemed to like. He had long, shaggy hair, a thick beard, and an easygoing smile. He was originally from West Germany, but had grown up in San Antonio, Texas, before finding his way to the Pacific Northwest and eventually Alaska. He worked odd jobs on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, making good money, but his real passion was photography. Carl had a dream. He wanted to do what the great nature photographers did. He wanted to immerse himself in the wild, alone, for months on end, to capture the raw beauty of the Alaskan wilderness without the interference of civilization. He wanted to photograph the caribou migrations, the wolves, the bears, and the changing of the seasons. So, in late 1980, he began planning his magnum opus. He would spend 5 months from March to August camped alone at a remote, unnamed lake in the Brooks Range, about 75 miles northeast of a tiny settlement called Fort Yukon. Carl was not a total novice. He had spent time in the woods before. He knew how to handle a rifle. He knew how to set up a camp. But Carl had a fatal flaw. He was a dreamer. And sometimes dreamers overlook the boring, gritty details of reality. In March of 1981, Carl hired a bush pilot to fly him out to this remote lake. The plane was a small, single-engine aircraft on skis, capable of landing on the frozen surface of the lake. They loaded up the plane. Carl brought an immense amount of gear. He had 500 rolls of film, he had 2 rifles and a shotgun for protection and hunting. He had hundreds of pounds of beans, rice, and dried meat. He had photography equipment worth thousands of dollars. As the plane hummed over the white, frozen expanse of the Brooks Range, Carl must have felt the thrill of adventure. He was leaving the noise of the world behind. The pilot landed the plane on the ice. The engine idled, the propeller spinning against the cold air. They unloaded the boxes. Carl McCunn stood there in his parka, breathing in the frigid air, looking at the spot that would be his home for the next 5 months. And this is where the mystery begins. This is where the first domino fell. The pilot, a man who had flown many people into the bush, asked Carl a standard question. When do you want me to come back and pick you up? Now, in the world of bush flying, this is the most important conversation you will ever have. You set a date. You set a time. You set a backup date in case of bad weather. You write it down. You pay a deposit. But Carl was casual. He told the pilot, I am not sure yet. I might stay a bit longer. I might leave early. I will figure it out. The conversation was loose, vague. Carl McCunn was under the impression that he could just signal a plane when he was ready, or that this pilot would check on him at the end of the season. The pilot, on the other hand, left with the understanding that Carl McCunn had not yet hired him for a return trip, and that Carl would likely find another way back, perhaps with friends who were coming to visit, or another charter service. The pilot got back in his plane, taxied across the ice, and took off. Carl watched the plane disappear into the white sky. The sound of the engine faded away, leaving behind a silence so deep and heavy it felt like a physical weight. Carl was now completely alone. For the first few months, everything went according to plan. It was a photographer's paradise. As spring melted into summer, the ice on the lake broke up. The tundra exploded with wildflowers. The days grew longer until the sun was circling the sky 24 hours a day. Carl spent his days hiking and taking incredible photos. He chronicled his life in a diary. His entries from this time are filled with wonder. He wrote about tracking a pack of wolves. He wrote about the majesty of the grizzly bears that roamed the valley. He cooked his beans, he read his books, and he felt like he was living the dream. He was the king of his own private kingdom. But as July turned into August, the reality of the Alaskan calendar began to set in. In the Brooks Range, summer is a fleeting, beautiful lie. By mid-August, the air starts to get crisp. The leaves on the dwarf willows turn gold and then blood red. The sun starts to dip below the horizon again. The birds begin to fly south. Carl McCunn realized it was time to go home. His provisions were starting to run low. He had eaten most of his good food. He was down to the basics. And, more importantly, he was ready to develop those 500 rolls of film and show the world what he had seen. He began to wait for a plane. Every time he heard a distant hum, he would scramble out of his tent, scanning the sky. But the hum would usually fade away, just a high-altitude commercial jet flying 30,000 feet above, completely unaware of the man standing down there. August passed. The nights started getting cold. Frost began to cover his tent in the mornings. The lake water grew dark and slushy, preparing to freeze again. Carl began to worry. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had never actually confirmed a pickup date. He had assumed the pilot would remember him. He had assumed that someone would come looking. He wrote in his diary, I think I should have used more foresight about arranging my departure. I will soon find out. And then it happened. The moment that defines this entire story. It was late August or early September. The exact date is a bit fuzzy, but the event is crystal clear. Carl was at his campsite when he heard it, the distinct, low roar of a single-engine aircraft. And it was not high up, it was low. He burst out of his tent. He grabbed his orange sleeping bag cover to use as a flag. He ran to the edge of the lake. There, in the sky, was a plane. It was a small bush plane, the kind used by Alaska State Troopers or local hunters. The pilot had spotted the camp. The plane banked sharply and began to circle the lake. Carl McCunn's heart must have been hammering in his chest. This was it. Salvation. He was going home. The plane flew low over him. The pilot was looking down. Carl was overcome with relief and excitement. He stood there in the middle of the vast wilderness, and he raised his right arm. He waved his hand high in the air, pumping his fist, waving the orange cloth, shouting for joy. The plane circled once. Then it circled twice. Carl watched, a huge grin on his face, waiting for the plane to lower its flaps and descend for a landing on the water or the rough shoreline. But the plane did not land. Instead, the pilot leveled the wings. The engine roared as the pilot added power. And then the plane turned away. Carl stood there, his arms still raised, frozen in confusion. He watched as the plane got smaller and smaller. He watched until it was just a speck. He listened until the silence returned. Why did they leave? Why did they not land? It was not until later, when Carl went back to his tent and rummaged through his supplies, that he found a small hunting regulation booklet he had brought with him. On the back of one of the pages, there was a diagram. It was a chart of emergency hand signals used by air rescue teams. He looked at the chart, and his blood ran cold. The chart showed two different signals. One signal meant, "I need help. I am in distress. Pick me up." To make this signal, you were supposed to raise both arms above your head, forming the shape of the letter Y for, "Yes, I need help." The other signal meant, "I am okay. All is well. Do not wait." To make this signal, you raise one arm in the air. Carl McCunn, in his excitement to greet the pilot, had raised one arm. To the pilot looking down from above, he saw a man standing by a well-organized camp, looking healthy, waving one arm casually. The pilot interpreted this as a friendly traveler, saying, "Hello, I am fine. Great day for a flight." The pilot had actually dipped his wings a signal meaning message received and flown away, thinking he had just checked on a happy camper who wanted to be left alone. Carl McCunn had waved goodbye to his only chance of survival. The psychological blow of this realization was devastating. But Carl was a tough guy. He tried to stay positive. He wrote in his diary about his stupidity, but he also wrote that surely someone else would come. But no one else came. September hit like a hammer. The snow started to fall. The lake froze over completely. Now, Carl was in a fight for his life, but he was fighting a losing battle. He was out of food. He had spent months hiking and burning calories, and now he had no fuel to put back in his body. He tried to hunt, but the animals had migrated or gone into hibernation. The caribou were gone. The bears were sleeping. He managed to shoot a few ducks and muskrats, but it was not enough. He started digging into the snow to find dried rose hips, tiny berries that offered almost no nutritional value. His body began to consume itself. This is what happens during starvation. First, the body burns fat. Carl lost all his body fat. Then, the body begins to eat the muscles. Carl became weak. Walking became a chore. Gathering firewood became a marathon event. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, then 30 below, then 40 below. His tent, which was designed for three-season camping, was not built for an Arctic winter. He had to keep a fire going constantly, but he was too weak to chop wood. He started burning his notebooks. He contemplated burning his film, the very reason he was out there, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy his work. By November, Carl McCunn was a skeleton. He was suffering from frostbite. His hands and feet were turning black. The pain was excruciating. His diary entries from this time are heartbreaking. They shift from the observations of a naturalist to the ramblings of a man staring into the abyss. He wrote about dreams of food. He wrote about steak, about chocolate, about his family in Texas. He hallucinated that he heard planes, but the sky was empty. He knew he was not going to make it. He calculated the calories he needed versus what he had, and the math simply did not work. In late November, the darkness was almost total. The sun barely crested the horizon. Carl made a decision. He was not going to let the cold take him slowly. He was not going to lie there and freeze to death in agony while his mind unraveled. He sat down and wrote his final entry. It was a letter to his father and his friends. He asked them to forgive him for his carelessness. He gave instructions on how to develop his film. He wanted his photos to be seen. He wanted his life to have meant something. He wrote, "I have used my last bullet." This was not entirely true, as investigators would later find out, but it was a poetic way to say he had made his choice. Sometime in late November or early December of 1981, Carl McCunn lay down in his sleeping bag. He was wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned. He was emaciated, weighing perhaps half of what he weighed when he arrived. He took his rifle, he positioned it, and he pulled the trigger. The silence returned to the valley. The snow continued to fall, burying the tent, burying the man, and burying the camera gear that held the images of a beautiful, deadly summer. Months passed. The winter raged on. It was not until February 2nd, 1982, that an Alaska state trooper piloted a plane over the area. He noticed a tent half buried in the snow. It looked abandoned, but something felt wrong. Usually, trappers or hunters would have packed up by now. The trooper landed the plane on the frozen lake. He strapped on his snowshoes and hiked up to the campsite. The scene was eerie. It was perfectly silent. The wind whistled through the bare trees. The trooper approached the tent. He called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" There was no answer. The trooper unzipped the frozen door of the tent. Inside, he found the frozen body of Carl McCunn. He was incredibly thin, his face gaunt. Next to him was his diary, and right near the body was his driver's license. Carl had taken it out and placed it clearly in view so that whoever found him would know exactly who he was without having to search his pockets. It was a final act of consideration from a man who had been known for his kindness. But the most haunting thing found at the campsite was a small note, scrawled on a piece of paper. It read, "Dear God in heaven, please forgive me my weakness and my sins. Please look over my family." And then, a second note, perhaps the most tragic of all, "They flew right over me. I waved, they waved back, and then they left." The story of Carl McCunn became a legend in Alaska, a cautionary tale told to every greenhorn and newcomer who steps off a plane in Fairbanks or Anchorage. The photos he took were eventually developed. They were stunning. They showed the breathtaking beauty of the Brooks Range, the jagged mountains, the wildflowers, the herds of caribou moving like a river across the land. They showed a man who was deeply in love with the world. But looking at those photos now, it is hard not to see the ghost in the frame. It is hard not to think about the man behind the camera, the man who had everything he needed to survive, except for a calendar and a clear understanding of a hand signal. It is a reminder that in the wild, the line between life and death is razor thin. It is not always a bear attack or a fall from a cliff that kills you. Sometimes it is just a misunderstanding. Sometimes it is just a wave of the hand. Carl McCunn wanted to be one with nature. In the end, nature claimed him completely. He became part of the frozen landscape he loved so much, leaving behind only a tent, 500 rolls of film, and a story that makes you wonder. If you were standing there, alone in the silence, watching that plane fly away, what would you have done? So, the next time you are out in the woods, or even just hiking a local trail, remember Carl. Make a plan. Tell someone where you are going. And if you ever see a plane and you need help, remember to use two hands, because one hand might just be a wave goodbye. Today's story is about one of the most baffling disappearances in North American history. It is a case that sparked the largest search and rescue operation ever conducted in the Great Smoky Mountains, involving the FBI, the Green Berets, and thousands of volunteers. Yet, to this day, it remains unsolved. This is the story of Dennis Martin. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. To understand how truly terrifying this story is, you first have to understand the setting. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park, straddling the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, is a place of ancient, breathtaking beauty. It is named for the natural fog that hangs over the range and looks like large smoke plumes. It is a dense, temperate rainforest with over 800 square miles of wilderness. It is a place where families go to make memories, to camp, and to escape the noise of the city. But the locals know something else about these mountains. They know that the terrain is unforgiving. The vegetation is so thick, often called rhododendron hells, that a person can step 5 feet off the trail and completely disappear from view. It is in this vast green ocean of trees that the Martin family arrived for a Father's Day weekend trip. It was June 14th, 1969. Bill Martin, a successful architect from Knoxville, Tennessee, had been looking forward to this trip all year. It was an annual tradition for the Martin family. Every Father's Day, the men of the Martin family, Bill, his father Clyde, and his 2 sons, would hike into the mountains to camp. This year, they were headed to a place called Spencefield. Spencefield is a grassy bald, a high-altitude meadow sitting along the Appalachian Trail. It offers stunning views and wide-open spaces, making it a perfect spot for camping. Bill brought along his 2 sons. There was his older son, Douglas, and his younger son, Dennis. Dennis Martin was just 6 years old. He was a cute kid, a little small for his age, with a mop of dark hair and an adventurous spirit. On this particular trip, Dennis was wearing a very distinct outfit. He had on a bright red t-shirt, green shorts, and white socks with little Oxford-style shoes. That red shirt is a crucial detail because in the deep greens and browns of the forest, red is the one color that should stand out like a beacon. It is the color of safety, or at least it should have been. The hike up to Spence Field was grueling but uneventful. The family arrived at the clearing, set up their campsite, and began to enjoy the pristine mountain air. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the atmosphere was relaxed. There were other families up there too. In fact, another family, the Martins' friends, were camped nearby with their own 2 young sons. So, you had a group of 4 young boys running around the meadow, playing tag, and burning off energy while the fathers sat on the grass, chatting and keeping a casual eye on them. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the grass, the boys decided they wanted to play a prank on the adults. You know how kids are. They love the thrill of the jump scare. The plan was simple. The adults were sitting in a loose circle talking. The 4 boys would split up, sneak around the perimeter of the clearing, hide in the bushes, and then, on a silent signal, they would all jump out at once and scream to startle their dads. Because Dennis was the youngest, and because he was wearing that bright red shirt, the older boys told him he needed to hide separately so he would not give away their position. The 3 older boys went one way, creeping to the left. Dennis, eager to play his part perfectly, went the other way. He trotted off alone toward a patch of dense brush on the edge of the forest. Bill Martin watched his son go. He saw the flash of the bright red shirt as Dennis ducked behind a large bush. Bill smiled, knowing exactly what the kids were up to. He leaned back, ready to play along, ready to act surprised when the boys jumped out. He watched the bush where Dennis was hiding. He was only about 20 or 30 feet away. It was close. Close enough to throw a baseball. Close enough to hear a twig snap. A few minutes passed. The tension built in that playful way children love. Then, the signal was given. Boom. From the left side of the clearing, the 3 older boys burst out of the bushes, screaming and laughing. The fathers jumped, feigning shock, laughing along with the kids. It was a chaotic, happy moment of family fun. But Bill Martin was not looking at the 3 boys. He was looking to his right. He was looking at the bush where Dennis had hidden. He was waiting for his 6-year-old to jump out and join the fun. But Dennis did not jump out. The laughter of the other boys died down. They looked around, breathless and smiling. "Where's Dennis?" one of them asked. Bill stood up. He felt a tiny prick of annoyance, thinking maybe Dennis had misunderstood the plan or was just being shy. "Dennis?" he called out. "Okay, buddy, you got us. You can come out now." There was no answer, just the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass of Spence Field. Bill walked over to the bush. He expected to see his son crouch down, giggling, hand over his mouth. Bill reached out and pulled the branches aside. There was nothing there. The space behind the bush was empty. At that specific moment, panic did not set in fully. Not yet. The human brain tries to rationalize things. Bill assumed Dennis had just moved to a better hiding spot. Maybe he had crawled a little further back into the woods to be even sneakier. "Dennis!" Bill yelled louder. "Come on out!" Bill stepped past the bush and entered the tree line. He walked 10 yards, then 20 yards. He scanned the woods. The trees were dense here, the undergrowth thick with rhododendrons and mountain laurel. "Dennis!" Silence. Bill turned back to the other adults. The look on his face had changed. The other fathers saw it immediately, that sudden, sharp transition from relaxation to alertness. They all stood up. "He's not there," Bill said, his voice rising in pitch. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, the men frantically searched the immediate area. They ran in widening circles, calling Dennis's name. They checked the nearby trails. They checked the steep drop-offs. But there was no sign of him. No flash of a red shirt. No sound of a crying child. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole in the span of 3 minutes. Bill Martin, realizing this was serious, ran miles down the trail to the ranger station to get help. By 8 in the evening, the National Park Service had been alerted. Rangers began to converge on Spence Field, but then the situation went from bad to catastrophic. As night fell over the Great Smoky Mountains, the weather turned. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in, blocking out the moon and stars. The temperature plummeted, and then the sky broke open. A massive thunderstorm struck the mountain range. It was not just a little rain, it was a deluge. In a matter of hours, nearly 3 inches of rain fell. Thunder shook the ground, and lightning flashed, illuminating the terrified faces of the searchers. This storm was the worst possible thing that could have happened. For one, it meant that a 6-year-old boy, wearing only a t-shirt and shorts, was out there alone in the freezing, wet dark. Hypothermia would set in rapidly, but from an investigative standpoint, the storm was a disaster. The torrential rain washed away everything. If there were footprints, they were turned to mud. If there was a scent trail for tracking dogs to follow, it was obliterated. The rain scrubbed the mountain clean of clues. When the sun rose the next morning, the reality of the situation set in. Dennis Martin was gone, and the clock was ticking. What followed was the largest search effort in the history of the National Park Service. News of the missing boy spread across the country. It touched a nerve. Everyone could imagine the horror of a child lost in the woods. Volunteers flooded into the park. We are talking about Boy Scout troops, college students, firemen, police officers, and local hunters. At the peak of the search, there were over 1,400 people scouring the mountainside. The search was massive, but it was also chaotic. In 1969, search and rescue protocols were not as refined as they are today. The massive influx of well-meaning volunteers actually created a problem. Thousands of people trampling through the woods destroyed any potential physical evidence that the rain had missed. They left their own footprints, dropped their own trash, and created so much noise that if Dennis had been crying out for help, no one would have heard him over the shouting of the searchers. Desperate to find the boy, the request went all the way to the White House. President Richard Nixon was briefed on the situation. In an unprecedented move, the federal government sent in the Green Berets, the special forces of the United States Army. 64 highly trained Green Berets were deployed to the Smokies. These were men trained to track enemies in the jungles of Vietnam. If anyone could find a 6-year-old boy in the woods, it was them. They set up a grid search. They moved shoulder to shoulder, crawling through the brush, checking every hollow log, every cave, every crevice. Helicopters with thermal sensors, which were primitive at the time but still high-tech for the era, flew overhead. Bloodhounds were brought in. Days turned into a week. A week turned into 2. Despite the Green Berets, the helicopters, the bloodhounds, and the thousands of volunteers, they found absolutely nothing. No scrap of red cloth, no shoe, no body. However, there were strange clues. Clues that have fueled mysteries and conspiracy theories for over 50 years. The first clue was a set of footprints found near a stream miles away from Spence Field. The tracks were small, the right size for a 6-year-old. But here is the strange part. One footprint was from an Oxford shoe, like Dennis was wearing. The other footprint was barefoot. Why would he take off one shoe? And why were the tracks leading into such rugged, dangerous territory, far away from where he disappeared? The searchers followed the direction of the tracks until they vanished into the brush, but they led to nowhere. The second clue, or rather, the second lead, is the most disturbing part of this entire story. It is the detail that keeps people awake at night. Several miles away from Spence Field, around the same time Dennis went missing, a tourist named Harold Key was hiking with his family near an area called Sea Creek. This area is very remote, rugged, and difficult to access. Harold Key and his family heard something terrifying. They heard a scream. It was an enormous, sickening scream. Harold Key described it later as a scream that definitely came from a child, a scream of pure terror. Harold stopped and scanned the ridge above him to see where the noise came from. He saw movement. Through the trees, he saw a figure, but it was not a child. Harold Key told investigators that he saw a wild man. He described a disheveled, rough-looking man moving quickly through the trees. The man appeared to be hiding, moving with a strange, stealthy gait. But the most chilling detail was that this man appeared to be carrying something on his shoulder. Harold Key could not make out exactly what the bundle was, but he saw something red. Remember, Dennis Martin was wearing a bright red shirt. Harold Key thought the man looked suspicious enough that he reported it to the park rangers and the FBI. He told them about the scream, the rough-looking man, and the red object. Now, you would think this would be the breakthrough. You would think the FBI would swarm that ridge, hunting for this wild man. But that is not what happened. The FBI and the Park Service authorities determined that the sighting was too far away from Spence Field to be relevant. They calculated the distance and the ruggedness of the terrain and decided that a 6-year-old boy could not have traveled that far in the time between his disappearance and when Harold Key heard the scream. They concluded that there was no way the two events were connected. They dismissed the lead. Years later, however, expert trackers and hikers have disputed this dismissal. They argue that if Dennis had been abducted, if someone had grabbed him the moment he stepped behind that bush, the kidnapper could have moved quickly. Or perhaps Dennis, fueled by the adrenaline of panic, had run much faster and further than anyone estimated. But the authorities kept the Harold Key sighting quiet for a long time. It was not until much later, through Freedom of Information Act requests and leaked documents, that the public learned the full extent of this sighting. There is another layer to the wild man theory. The Great Smoky Mountains have a long history of folklore involving feral humans, or mountain men who live completely off the grid, deep in the woods, detached from civilization. While most people dismiss these as campfire stories, there have been actual documented cases of fugitives and hermits living in those mountains for years without being detected. Did Dennis Martin stumble upon one of these individuals? Was he snatched by a predator who used the chaos of the mountains to hide? The search for Dennis Martin was eventually scaled back and then finally called off. It remains the most extensive and expensive search in the park's history. The Green Berets packed up and left. The volunteers went home. The Martin family was left with a hole in their hearts that would never heal. Bill Martin spent the rest of his life looking for his son. He spent his fortune, his energy, and his sanity trying to find answers. He never gave up hope that perhaps Dennis was still alive somewhere, or that at least his remains would be found so he could give him a proper burial. But the mountain never gave Dennis back. There is a tragic footnote to this story. Years later, overwhelmed by the grief and the lack of closure, and possibly suffering from other life struggles, Bill Martin passed away. Some say he died of a broken heart. The mystery of what happened on that grassy hill in 1969 destroyed not just one life, but an entire family. To this day, if you hike the Appalachian Trail near Spence Field, it is a beautiful, serene place. The views are just as spectacular as they were in 1969. But if you know the story, the silence of the woods feels a little heavier there. You look at the dense rhododendron thickets, the hells, and you wonder, how does a boy vanish in 60 seconds? Did he get lost and succumb to the elements, his small body hidden in a crevice that searchers missed by inches? Was he taken by a mountain lion? Though no blood or torn clothing was ever found. Or was there something darker roaming the woods that day? A wild man who saw a flash of a red shirt and seized an opportunity? We will likely never know the truth. The disappearance of Dennis Martin remains one of the most unsettling mysteries of the national park system. It is a reminder that no matter how safe we feel, the wilderness is vast, indifferent, and full of secrets. And that is where the story ends. But the question remains, what really happened to Dennis Martin? If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, this case is the ultimate example of why you should always keep your loved ones close when you step into the wild. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a single turn around a bush for someone to be gone forever. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are looking at an object that is supposed to measure time, but instead became a terrifying harbinger of temporal dislocation. This is the story of a man whose life was perfectly normal until a simple piece of jewelry told him he was living on a day that didn't exist. This is the story of the watch that stopped on the wrong day. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the city of Boston, Massachusetts in the late 1980s. Our protagonist is a man named Victor Thorne. Victor was a history professor at a respected university, known for his meticulous research and absolute reliance on facts. He was a creature of routine, and his most prized possession was an antique, self-winding Swiss watch, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that had belonged to his grandfather. The watch was a reliable timepiece. Victor wound it every evening and wore it every day. It had a small circular window that displayed the current day of the week, Monday through Sunday. The date everything went wrong was a Thursday. Victor woke up at 7 a.m., exactly as usual. He put on his suit, grabbed his briefcase, and strapped the watch onto his wrist. He glanced down at the face to check the time before heading out the door. The time was correct, 7:28 a.m. But the small day of the week window was wrong. It was stopped, frozen permanently on the word Saturday. Victor frowned. The watch hadn't stopped completely. The hour and minute hands were moving perfectly, the sweep second hand tracking the time with impeccable accuracy. Only the day of the week mechanism was stuck. He knew he hadn't worn the watch on the previous Saturday. He wore a different one on weekends. He assumed the mechanism must have jammed overnight. Victor, ever the practical man, tried to fix it. He pulled out the crown and manually cycled the date mechanism. It clicked perfectly through the days. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. He cycled it all the way to Thursday, then pushed the crown back in. The day read, Thursday. He went to work, taught his classes, and finished his day. When he returned home that evening, he checked his watch to wind it. The watch was running perfectly, but the day of the week window was frozen again. It displayed Saturday. This time, Victor felt a prickle of unease. He was certain he had set it to Thursday. He spent the next hour examining the watch under a jeweler's loupe. He could find no physical defect. The internal gears governing the day wheel seemed flawless. It was a complete mechanical mystery. He decided to leave it on Saturday and simply ignore the jammed mechanism. The next day, Friday, Victor arrived at the university. He was in the faculty lounge discussing a history paper when a colleague mentioned the upcoming weekend. "Can't wait for Saturday," the colleague said, stretching. Victor instinctively glanced at his watch. The day window still read Saturday. The time was exactly 10:01 a.m. a.m. Just as he looked at the watch, he felt a sudden, profound drop, not physical, but internal, like the feeling you get when a roller coaster crests a peak. The air around him suddenly felt heavy and flat. The vivid colors of the room seemed to momentarily dull, and the ambient noise of the lounge, the clinking of coffee cups, the muffled conversations seemed to compress. The feeling passed in a fraction of a second, so fast that neither of his colleagues noticed. But when Victor looked back at his colleague, the man was no longer talking about the weekend. He was staring intently at a stack of papers. 17-1. Anyway, as I was saying about the French Revolution, the colleague continued, picking up a sentence that Victor had completely missed. The primary catalyst was economic disparity. Victor looked at his watch again. The time was still 10:01 a.m. He felt a sudden, growing sense of unreality. He checked his phone and his briefcase clock. Both were running perfectly, showing that 1 minute had elapsed. He went home that evening, disturbed, but unable to pinpoint the source of his anxiety. The next morning, Saturday, Victor woke up. He put on his casual clothes. He looked at his watch. It was running perfectly. The day window still read, Saturday. He felt no internal drop, no sensation of temporal compression. The day felt perfectly normal, aligning with his own internal calendar. That afternoon, he went to a bookstore he frequented every Saturday. The owner, a friend, greeted him warmly. "Victor, good to see you. How was your Thursday? Did you get those books you were looking for?" Victor stared at him. "It was fine, but today is Saturday, John. I was here last Saturday." John frowned. "Victor, you know you weren't here last Saturday. You told me you had a conference. Today is Saturday, October 21st. Victor knew, absolutely and certainly, that the previous day had been Friday, October 21st. He spent the rest of that Saturday in a state of growing panic, checking dates everywhere, newspapers, library, microfiche, his own calendar. Everything confirmed that he was in the correct timeline. But his internal clock, the watch on his wrist, and the subtle interactions he had with the world suggested otherwise. He realized the horror. The day mechanism of the watch was not broken. It was correct. The day window reading Saturday was true. But the day he was living was Thursday. He was experiencing a 2-day temporal displacement. His entire existence was running on a Saturday loop while the rest of the world marched through Thursday and Friday. The moment he tried to interact with the world on those wrong days, the world compensated, skipping the conversation, adjusting the details, making him feel the temporal drop as reality smoothed itself out. He tried to prove it. On the next Thursday, which his watch insisted was Saturday, he called his wife, who was away on a business trip. "Darling, what are you doing right now?" he asked. "I'm boarding the plane, Victor." "We talked about this," she said patiently. Victor looked at his own detailed calendar. Her flight wasn't scheduled until Saturday morning. He realized the danger. He wasn't just observing a time difference, he was living a parallel existence that was constantly being corrected by the primary reality. The Saturday he was living was his own personal 2-day time loop, caused by the watch that was somehow anchored to a different timeline. He tried to throw the watch away. He wrapped it in a towel and tried to bury it in his garden. But every time he returned from a brief errand, the watch was back on his nightstand, running perfectly, still displaying Saturday. He took it to a master clockmaker, explaining only that the day mechanism was stuck. The clockmaker spent a week with the watch, finally returning it and stating, "Baffled. Professor, I disassembled and reassembled the day wheel 3 times. There is no physical flaw. The watch is simply refusing to move past Saturday." Victor finally understood the profound implication. The watch was keeping him locked in a cycle of time that was continually being corrected. The climax of the story came exactly 1 week after the initial incident, on the next Thursday, which Victor's watch stubbornly displayed as Saturday. Victor was teaching a lecture on the fall of the Roman Empire. The class was large, and he was standing at the podium. He glanced at his watch. The time was 1:05 p.m. The day was Saturday. As he spoke, he felt the familiar, terrifying temporal drop. The colors dulled, and the sound compressed. The world was skipping forward 2 days to compensate for his presence in the wrong time. When the feeling subsided, he was still standing at the podium, but the classroom was now empty. The chalkboard was clean. The desks were cleared. The clock on the wall read 3:05 p.m. He had been thrown 2 hours forward in time, completely skipping his own lecture, simply because the reality had to eliminate the 2 hours of conversation he was not supposed to have on a Thursday. He was furious, terrified, and desperate. He raised his wrist and screamed at the watch. "What do you want?" He looked down at the face. The time was 3:05 p.m., and for the first time since the ordeal began, the day window moved. It clicked with an audible, sharp sound. The day window now read Sunday. Victor felt a chill that went straight to his core. He had been so focused on the 2-day lag that he had failed to see the ultimate horror. The watch was not stuck on Saturday. It was stuck on the day he was killed. The moment the world moved past Sunday, the watch would try to return him to the correct day of the week, but his body would not be there. He spent the next 3 days in a state of catatonic dread, waiting for the watch to catch up. He didn't dare leave his apartment. On the next Sunday, which his watch still displayed as Sunday, Victor was sitting alone in his living room. The clock struck 7 p.m. The lights in his apartment flickered and died. The air became intensely cold. Victor heard a sound, the subtle, high-pitched whine of the internal gears of the watch winding forward. He watched the day window. It moved slowly, painfully, clicking past Monday. Victor felt the final, ultimate temporal drop. The darkness was absolute. He woke up the next morning. He was lying on the floor. The apartment was still dark. He looked at his wrist. The watch was gone. He was alive. He had survived the temporal jump. But as he staggered to his feet, he looked down at his hand. He was no longer wearing his old silk pajamas. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, a heavy, faded gray institutional uniform. He stumbled to the window and looked out. It was still Boston, but the cars were different. The buildings were older, and the sky was a sickly, unfamiliar yellow. He was no longer in his apartment. He was in a small, cramped room with barred windows. A voice called out from the hallway. "Wake up, number 7! Oh, 4! It's Monday! Time for your therapy!" Victor realized the truth. The watch hadn't taken his life. It had simply thrown him forward in time, past his death, and into a future where he was institutionalized, classified only by a number. And to this day, Victor Thorne lives in that future, forever searching the faces of the people around him for a hint of recognition, always terrified that one day he will see an old Swiss watch stuck on Saturday resting on someone's wrist. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the watch that stopped on the wrong day. Until next time, take care of yourselves. How is everyone doing today? I hope you are all well, and if you are not, I hope things get better for you soon. Welcome back to the channel. I've got a true story for you today. It is strange, it is dark, and it is mysterious. And it details the terrifying events that occurred in one of the most remote, utterly isolated ghost towns in North America, Kennecott, Alaska, a town frozen in time, haunted not just by history, but by the powerful, vengeful curse of the copper mine itself. Before we get into the story, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Go down into the comment section and let me know. I always enjoy seeing how far the strange, dark, and mysterious family extends. Now, let's get into the story. Our narrative takes us back to the far northern frontier of Alaska, high up in the Wrangell Street Elias National Park, to a ghost town named Kennecott. Kennecott was once a booming, thriving mining camp built almost entirely around a massive copper deposit discovered in the early 1900s. It was an industrial marvel, accessible only by a single winding railroad track deep in a wilderness defined by immense glaciers and towering, impossibly cold mountains. The town was abandoned abruptly in 1938 when the copper ran out. The company packed up its operations, but rather than removing the buildings, they simply locked the doors and walked away. The result is a perfectly preserved, silent industrial town of colossal wooden structures, mill buildings, and processing facilities, all left at the mercy of the brutal Alaskan winters. The entire place is a frozen monument to greed and haste. Our story focuses on a team of 3 civilian engineers and 1 historian hired by the National Park Service in the early 1990s. Their mission was straightforward: assess the structural integrity of the massive mill building, the largest wooden structure in Alaska, before the Park Service could begin preservation efforts. They were essentially historians of decay. The team consisted of Dr. Aaron Wells, the lead engineer, and an expert in cold weather physics, Ben and Lisa, 2 structural technicians, and Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, who was obsessed with the strange, short, and wildly profitable history of the Kennecott mine. The team arrived in late October. The last bush plane dropped them off, promising to return in exactly 2 weeks. They were equipped with satellite phones, generators, and enough high-tech monitoring gear to stabilize a small skyscraper. The atmosphere in Kennecott was immediately unsettling. The town felt utterly, profoundly silent. The immense wooden mill building, 12 stories high, built into the side of the glacier, loomed over them like a massive sleeping beast. Everything was covered in a deep layer of dust and ice. Dr. Gray, the historian, quickly uncovered the source of the town's strange, dark, and mysterious energy. She found old, local rumors that suggested the Kennecott copper deposit was not a natural occurrence. The local Athabascan tribes had long warned against mining that specific mountain, claiming it was the heart of the sleeping stone, and that the rich copper veins were the frozen metal blood of a powerful, ancient mountain spirit. Taking the copper, they warned, would result in a terrible, slow, and specific curse upon the thieves. Dr. Wells, the engineer, dismissed this as folklore. He was focused on the mill building. As they began their structural analysis, they discovered something physically impossible. The massive wooden beams and supporting trusses that made up the enormous structure were not simply cold. They registered an internal temperature several degrees lower than the external air temperature. The wood was actively, aggressively cold, acting as a massive heat sink, drawing energy out of the air. "It's thermodynamic nonsense," Wells muttered, checking his sensors. "The wood is radiating cold. It's colder than the ice it's built into." Over the next few days, the team began to feel the effects of this impossible cold. Their high-tech generators constantly stalled. Their batteries drained at an unnatural rate. The temperature inside their own heated cabin remained stubbornly frigid. Then, the phenomena became more focused and terrifying. Ben, the structural technician, was working alone on the 7th floor of the mill, installing a stress monitor onto a massive beam. He was wearing thick gloves and a heavy parka. Suddenly, he heard a sound, not a human sound, but the sound of heavy, dry, rhythmic metal grinding, as if the huge, silent, ore-crushing machinery deep in the mill's basement had inexplicably roared to life. Ben froze, listening. The sound was followed by a sharp, clear voice, not from the radio, but originating from the hollow wooden walls right next to him. The voice was deep, resonant, and spoke in perfect, clear English, yet it sounded like gravel being scraped against steel. The voice said simply, "Thief, return the blood." Ben threw his tools and scrambled down the 12 flights of stairs in a blind panic. When he reached the bottom, he found the other members of the team, who had heard nothing but Ben's screams echoing in the vast empty structure. Wells, the lead engineer, still insisted on a logical explanation: resonant frequencies, structural settling, wind noise, but he couldn't explain the voice. Dr. Gray, however, knew. She had found a specific reference in the old mine logs. The local Athabascan legend warned that the curse of the heart of the sleeping stone was not aimed at their lives, but at their warmth and their tools. The spirit would not kill them directly, but would slowly, methodically, freeze their very purpose, their machines, their power, and their will until they succumbed to the mountain's cold. The most bizarre, dark, and mysterious event occurred the next night. The team was huddled in their cabin, afraid to leave. They heard the sound of footsteps outside. Not human footsteps, but a slow, heavy, rhythmic, dragging sound moving across the hard-packed ice right outside their windows. It sounded like something with immense, massive feet was slowly circling their cabin. Mike, the engineer, grabbed the high-powered thermal camera and looked out the window, pointing the lens into the darkness. What the camera showed defied everything Dr. Wells believed about physics. There was a figure outside the cabin, a colossal silhouette about 10 feet tall. But the creature was not hot or cold. It was perfectly, absolutely null. It registered 0 Kelvin, a terrifying, impossible temperature that showed up on the thermal camera as a blank, perfectly black void against the warm purple background of the snow. It was a zone of pure, absolute cold moving in the physical world. The creature was dragging something. The thermal camera captured the sight of a large, heavy, antique copper kettle being dragged across the ice. The kettle was radiating a fierce, localized heat, the only warm spot in the entire scene, glowing white-hot against the creature's cold blackness. As the creature stopped right outside their door, the voice, the grinding, gravelly voice, spoke again, inside their heads this time. "The warmth is mine. It leaves with the blood." The team understood the horrifying symbolism. The copper was the blood of the mountain, and the creature, the vengeful spirit, was collecting the copper and the heat energy it represented, storing it in the copper kettle before taking it back to the frozen core of the mill. Dr. Wells, abandoning all pretense of scientific objectivity, realized the only way to survive was to somehow break the curse's focus. They had 1 day left before the bush plane was due. They had to survive until morning. Wells developed a desperate plan. They had to return the source of the heat back to the mill, confusing the spirit's focus. The primary heat source in the cabin was their generator. They managed to haul the heavy, sputtering generator out onto the snow and dragged it toward the colossal mill building. The air grew impossibly cold as they neared the mill, the internal cold of the wood now actively attacking them. Their eyelids felt glued shut and their lungs burned. As they approached the massive mill entrance, the sound of the metallic grinding began again, growing deafening. They saw the creature. It was standing at the threshold of the mill, its null-black form outlined by the dim moonlight. The copper kettle was sitting at its feet, radiating intense, pure heat. Wells, on the verge of collapse, pushed the sputtering generator over the threshold. The generator roared, spewing heat and exhaust into the cold air. The moment the generator's heat hit the ground, the creature reacted. It let out a single, piercing, non-acoustic shriek of pure, telepathic pain that knocked the team backward onto the ice. The mill building then reacted. The massive wooden structure, 12 stories of silent, dead timber, began to groan not from settling, but from immense internal effort. The internal temperature sensors, which they were still carrying, spiked violently, showing a sudden, catastrophic internal heat surge that should have instantly incinerated the building. The colossal structure was fighting itself, the generator's heat against the mountain's cold. The creature's null-black form dissolved instantly into a cloud of swirling, white, supercooled vapor. The copper kettle, now empty, rolled across the ice and shattered into 1,000 shards of brittle, frozen metal. When the snow settled, the mill was silent again. The internal heat surge vanished, returning the mill to its impossible cold. The generator was now silent, completely seized and frozen solid. The team staggered back to the cabin, barely alive. The next morning, the bush plane arrived. The pilots found the team severely frostbitten, nearly incoherent, but alive. The pilots reported an anomaly. The massive wooden mill building, which had stood perfectly preserved for decades, was now covered in thousands of tiny, microscopic fractures that were all concentrated around the massive support beams. The wood had been violently stressed, as if the mill had been momentarily twisted from the inside out. The team was evacuated. They all suffered permanent nerve damage from the cold exposure, and they all carried one permanent auditory injury. A continuous, faint internal tinnitus that sounded exactly like the low, rhythmic grinding of the silent copper mill. The official report blamed hypothermia and a localized mechanical failure for the team's distress. Dr. Wells, however, never practiced engineering again. He dedicated his life to researching the strange, dark, and mysterious relationship between geometry and heat. His final unpublished theory stated that the curse of Kennecott was the mountain's method of reversing entropy, actively cooling and freezing the remnants of the human endeavor, ensuring the mountain's time would never pass. The final dark postscript to the story. Dr. Ellen Gray, the historian, years later, was monitoring the National Park Service's live stream from a camera placed high on the mountain overlooking the abandoned mill. The camera was running silently. One night, the camera captured something impossible. The enormous copper mill building, 12 stories of decaying wood, did not move. But the massive shadow it cast onto the glacier below suddenly and violently stretched and retracted, as if the mill were breathing a massive, silent, living heart, still sucking the heat from the world around it, waiting for the next brave souls to challenge the curse of the frozen copper mine. And that is where our story ends, with the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the true curse is not death, but the eternal, impossible, profound cold. If you enjoyed this strange, dark, and mysterious story, please consider hitting that like button, and if you are new here, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all on the next one. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are hitting the road for a classic piece of Americana, The Vanishing Hitchhiker Legend. But this isn't the story your grandmother told you. This is a real-life, documented account from a lonely stretch of highway where the spectral and the physical world collided, leaving behind a terrifying mystery. This is the story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story centers on a specific, desolate stretch of highway known as Route 12, winding its way through the rugged, sparsely populated mountains of upstate New York. It's a road notorious for its hairpin turns, thick fog, and a long, tragic history of fatal accidents. The specific incident we're focusing on occurred in the dead of winter, in the year 1985. Our protagonist is a man named James Donovan. James was a traveling salesman for a regional paper company, a job that kept him on the road constantly. He was a skeptical, pragmatic man, utterly grounded in reality. He was driving his beat-up Ford sedan, heading back toward Albany after a long, unsuccessful day trying to close a deal in a remote town near the Canadian border. It was nearly 11 o'clock p.m. The temperature was well below freezing, and a thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The radio was fading in and out, the static almost as loud as the distant whine of his engine. James was driving slowly, nervously peering through the misty beam of his headlights when he saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road, directly illuminated by his high beams, was a young woman. She was clearly in distress. She was wearing a thin, pale blue formal dress completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Her dark hair was wet, plastered against her pale face, and she was standing stiffly, her thumb out, shivering violently. She looked like she had wandered out of a high school prom and into a nightmare. James, despite his exhaustion and his common sense telling him not to stop on a dark, foggy road, couldn't leave her there. He slowed down, pulled the sedan onto the snowy shoulder, and rolled down the passenger window. The moment he saw her face up close, he felt a wave of profound unease. Her eyes were wide, dark, and fixed on him with an expression of pure, bone-deep terror. "Where are you going?" James asked, trying to sound friendly. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "The bridge. I need to get to the old covered bridge, just up the road. Please, I have to get there now." Quote. James knew the bridge she meant. It was about 3 miles further down Route 12. It was an iconic, but very remote, landmark. "All right, hop in." "You're freezing," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. The girl quickly opened the door and slid into the seat. The moment she settled beside him, James was hit by an intense wave of cold. It was far colder than the outside air, a chilling, damp cold that seemed to radiate directly from her body. He pulled back onto the highway. "My name is James. What's yours?" "Eliza," she replied, her voice still thin and strained. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead on the road, watching the fog-shrouded path ahead. James tried to make small talk, asking her what she was doing out here, who she was with, and why she was wearing a summer dress. Eliza's replies were short, fragmented, and strange. She mumbled something about a terrible argument and having to leave. She kept repeating that she was late and that she had to warn them. As they drove, James noticed something else disturbing. Despite the overwhelming cold she exuded, there was no sign of condensation, frost, or even a single shiver visible on her skin. She was perfectly, chillingly still. He glanced down at his dashboard. The thermometer gauge was inexplicably climbing, not dropping. The interior of the car was getting hotter, yet the cold radiating from Eliza was making James's side of the car feel like a freezer. They had been driving for about 5 minutes when the fog suddenly thickened, becoming an opaque, blinding wall of white. James had to slow the car down to barely 10 miles per hour. "Almost there," Eliza whispered, her voice tightening with dread. "It's coming." "What's coming, Eliza? The bridge?" "No," she said, her voice now dangerously calm. The sound of the car hitting the guardrail. James's blood ran cold. The way she said it was not a prediction. It was a statement of fact, a memory. He realized the horror of the situation. He wasn't giving a ride to someone in trouble. He was giving a ride to someone who had already been in trouble. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a shuddering halt in the middle of the empty highway. "Eliza, what are you talking about? Who are you?" he demanded, turning to face her. She finally looked at him. Her face was no longer pale. It was completely translucent, the color of milky glass. Her wide, dark eyes held an expression of infinite sorrow and regret. "I tried to tell them. I was supposed to be here," she said, her voice fading to a wispy echo. "But I ran. I never should have left the dance." Then, from the fog directly ahead of them, came a sound. It was the sickening, unmistakable sound of grinding metal, followed by the shattering noise of glass exploding and a low, terrible crunch. The sounds were deafening, visceral, and felt incredibly close. James instinctively covered his head, bracing for impact. But the sounds faded instantly, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the snowy road. The car hadn't moved. James realized the sounds hadn't come from a new accident. They were echoes, residual noise caught in the terrifying vortex that was Eliza. He looked back at the passenger seat. The seat was empty. Eliza was gone. There was no sound of a door opening or closing, no tracks in the snow outside the door. She had simply vanished. But she had left something behind. On the black vinyl of the passenger seat, there was a small puddle of water, not frozen, not melted, but perfectly room temperature, and lying in the center of the water was a piece of jewelry, a tiny, silver locket, slightly tarnished. James didn't hesitate. He jammed the gear shift into drive and sped away, not stopping until he reached the lights of the next town, nearly 30 miles away. He didn't report the incident to the police immediately. He knew how absurd his story sounded. Instead, the next day, using the information he gleaned from local historical records, he drove back to the small town near the Canadian border. He went to the local library and started digging through old newspaper archives from the 1960s. He found it on the third day. A yellowed clipping from the town paper, dated November 24th, 1962. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Prom Night. 3 high schoolers killed in Route 12 crash." The article detailed how 3 students, 2 boys and a girl, had died in a massive car crash after leaving a high school dance. They had hit a patch of ice, slid, and slammed into the guardrail near the covered bridge. The names of the victims were listed. One of the names was Eliza Thorne. The article also mentioned a significant detail. Eliza was the only one in the vehicle who survived the initial impact, but she had been thrown from the car and had died hours later from exposure and injuries on the shoulder of the road. She was found still clutching a silver locket. The police determined the crash was caused by excessive speed, but the students' families maintained that the car had veered to avoid something they never identified. James Donovan now understood. Eliza wasn't warning him of the crash. She was a restless spirit, reenacting her final moments, forever hitchhiking back to the crash site where she should have warned her friends and where she ultimately died alone. The sounds James heard were the auditory remnants of the tragedy, the final, brutal noise of the car wreck that defined her death. James returned to the area near the old covered bridge. He found the exact stretch of road where he had stopped. He used a shovel to dig a small hole in the snow on the shoulder of the road, right where he had picked her up. He placed the silver locket into the hole, covered it with earth, and said a simple prayer for peace. He never saw Eliza again, but the story doesn't quite end there. 10 years later, in 1995, Route 12 was undergoing major construction. A team of road workers was widening the lane near the old covered bridge when they made an unexpected discovery. Buried just beneath the guardrail, they found the wreckage of an old Ford Fairlane from the 1960s. The car from the original tragedy, which had apparently been thrown over the embankment and buried by subsequent snow and repairs. And next to the car, they found the remains of 2 bodies. They were identified as the 2 male passengers from the accident. But only 2 bodies were accounted for. The police also found something else, a long, deep gouge in the pavement leading directly to the fatal spot. The gouge was much too clean and sharp to have been made by the initial impact. The road crew workers, when debriefed by the local sheriff, reported one strange detail. For the entire week they worked near that spot, they had battled an inexplicable, dense, localized fog that defied weather reports. And occasionally, late at night, when their work lights were on, they swore they could hear the faint, high-pitched scrape of something hard being dragged across the asphalt, desperately trying to get back to the crash site. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the vanishing hitchhiker of Route 12. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are exploring a chilling piece of urban folklore that migrated from the deep woods into a concrete city. This is a story about a very simple rule, a test of will, and the absolute terrifying consequence of breaking one single vital command. This is the story of Don't Look Up When You Hear the Whistle. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the vast, dense urban landscape of New York City, specifically within the sprawling, aged tunnels of the subway system in the late 1970s. This subterranean world is already a place of shadows, noise, and isolation, a perfect crucible for a strange, dark, and mysterious tale. Our protagonist is a young transit worker named Michael Rivera. Michael was in his early 20s, working as a signal maintainer, a dangerous, lonely job that required him to walk miles of dark track, checking and repairing communication lines and track switches, often in the dead of night. Michael was an educated man, highly skeptical of the ghost stories and urban legends that permeated the subterranean world of the transit workers. He dismissed talk of tunnel monsters and forgotten spirits as nonsense. However, one piece of folklore was repeated with such chilling seriousness by the veterans that even Michael paid attention. The rule of the midnight whistle. The old-timers warned every new recruit. If you are down in the tunnels alone between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and you hear a whistle, a clear, sharp, solitary note, you stop dead. You cover your head, and you do not, under any circumstances, look up. When Michael pressed the veterans for details, why? What happens? They would just shake their heads, their eyes holding a distant, genuine fear. It's not for seeing, kid. It's for hearing. If you look up, you become part of the sound. On a freezing Friday night in February, Michael was assigned to a deep stretch of track near a decommissioned subway loop, a massive, forgotten section known to be utterly silent and rarely used. At 2:30 a.m., Michael was deep in the tunnel, his helmet lamp cutting a lonely beam through the perpetual darkness. He was tightening a relay box, the metallic clink of his wrench, the only sound in the oppressive silence. He was focused on his work when it happened. He heard the whistle. It was not the sound of a train brake or a security guard's signal. It was a single, pure, high-pitched note, a sound so perfectly pitched and clear that it seemed to vibrate in the bone behind his ear. It sounded exactly like the sound made by blowing sharply across the top of an empty glass bottle, amplified tenfold. The sound was shockingly close, directly above him, resonating through the concrete arch of the tunnel roof. Michael froze instantly, dropping his wrench. The sound of the falling metal hitting the rail echoed for a long moment, but the whistle continued, holding that perfect, crystalline note. The old-timer's warnings flashed into his mind. Don't look up! He immediately bent down, tucking his head between his knees, covering his helmet with his gloved hands. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, listening to the impossible sound. The whistle did not stop. It held the note for what felt like an eternity, 30 seconds, then a full minute. The sound was so intense that it began to feel less like a whistle and more like a massive, sustained pressure, a physical force pushing down on the top of his skull. Then he heard something else, a sound of movement, faint but massive, scraping against the ceiling of the tunnel directly above him. It was a thick, wet shh, like a huge piece of canvas being dragged slowly across rough concrete. The sound was directly correlated with the whistle. The movement seemed to be generating the sound, or perhaps the sound was the movement. Michael's curiosity, the primal human need to understand, began to claw its way through his fear. What could make that sound? It was too big for a rat, too slow for a passing car, and too soft for a train. He felt an almost irresistible compulsion to raise his head, to turn his helmet lamp up, and to catch a glimpse of the thing moving across the ceiling. He fought it. He repeated the warning mantra in his mind. Don't look up. Don't look up. Finally, after what he calculated was almost 3 full minutes, the scraping sound and the whistle note abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was total and profound, broken only by Michael's frantic, shallow breathing. He waited another full minute, listening intently. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, Michael stood up. He left the wrench and his tools behind. He scrambled out of the tunnel and ran to the nearest emergency access ladder, climbing out and back into the cold, rational world of the surface. He didn't return to the tunnel that night. He called his supervisor, reporting a severe, localized electrical failure that necessitated immediate evacuation. He went home, shaken but alive. He was sure he had experienced a bizarre sensory illusion caused by stress and isolation, coupled with the old wives' tales. But the next day, the incident was far from over. Michael was back on the job, working in the main maintenance yard, trying to forget the whistle when his supervisor pulled him aside. Rivera, we have a problem. We need you to go back to that abandoned loop you were working on last night. What's the issue, sir? Michael asked, his stomach tightening. We sent a cleanup crew in after you reported the failure. They found your tools, but they also found something else. Something disturbing. Michael and the supervisor drove to the access point. Two other men were waiting, their faces pale and uneasy. They descended into the tunnel. The air was sterile, cold, and strangely dry. Michael led them to the spot where he had been working. There were his tools, lying where they had fallen. And there, etched into the rough, dusty concrete ceiling directly above the spot where Michael had stood, was a pattern. It wasn't paint or graffiti or grease. It was a series of shallow, perfectly parallel gouges, 5 separate, straight lines, each about a foot long, dug deeply into the solid concrete. The lines looked like they had been scored by something immensely heavy and sharp. The 5 gouges were separated by a gap of approximately 3 feet, and then the pattern repeated. 5 more gouges. 5 lines, pause, 5 lines. It was the whistle's rhythm, translated into physical damage. The creature above the tunnel had been tracing the pattern of the sound it was making into the concrete directly above Michael's head. The shirk Michael had heard was the sound of the unknown thing using 5 sharp, immense appendages to score the ceiling, followed by a pause and then 5 more scores. The supervisor shone his high-powered lamp directly onto the pattern. What the hell is this, Rivera? What were you doing down here? Michael just stared up at the impossible damage. His refusal to look up had saved his life. Or perhaps, saved his sanity. But the most terrifying discovery was made just a few feet away. The supervisor's lamp moved to the tunnel wall. And there, written in a thick, wet-looking reddish-brown fluid, was a single, crudely drawn symbol. It was a circle with a single, massive eye drawn in the center, staring directly down the tunnel toward the maintenance yard. Below the eye, scrawled into the concrete with the same thick fluid, were 4 words. They were written in perfect, clear English, and they were addressed directly to Michael. The message read, "We heard you breathing." The implication was terrifying. The entity knew he was there. It wasn't an accidental encounter. The whistle was a direct acknowledgement, and the rule, "Don't look up," was the only defense. The creature was waiting for a sound to identify and classify him. Michael immediately quit his job. He never set foot in the subway system again. He eventually moved out of New York, unable to bear the thought of the vast, silent world beneath the city that occasionally sends up its terrifying coded sounds. He often thinks of the thing that was directly above his head, the thing with 5 limbs, the intelligence that knows the frequency of a perfect note, and the patience to wait for 3 minutes until he made a sound. And sometimes, late at night, in the complete quiet of his new home, he thinks he can hear a faint, high-pitched ringing in his ears, a residual frequency left behind. And he instinctively ducks his head and covers his ears, praying that the sound remains internal and that he never, ever breaks the rule and looks up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of why you shouldn't look up when you hear the whistle. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Today's story is about a journey that was supposed to be a victory lap, but turned into a slow-motion nightmare. It is a story about the finest police officers in the world, men who were considered unbreakable, being slowly taken apart by the unforgiving silence of the Canadian North. It is a reminder that in the wild, confidence can be just as deadly as a bullet. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we first have to look at the man at the center of it. His name was Inspector Francis Fitzgerald. In 1910, Francis Fitzgerald was a legend in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. He was the kind of guy other cops wanted to be. He was handsome, he was tough, and he had spent his entire career in the Arctic. He had sailed the worst seas, arrested the most dangerous criminals, and traveled thousands of miles by dog sled. He was known as the man who never failed. Because of his stellar reputation, Fitzgerald was chosen for a prestigious assignment. Every winter, the Mounted Police did a patrol, a mail run from Fort McPherson, which is way up in the Northwest Territories, to Dawson City in the Yukon. This was not a walk in the park. It was a 475-mile trek through some of the most rugged, mountainous terrain on Earth. But for a man like Fitzgerald, it was routine. In fact, Fitzgerald didn't just want to do the patrol. He wanted to destroy the record. He wanted to make the trip faster than anyone had ever done it before. He selected his team carefully. He picked 3 men. First, there was Constable Richard Taylor. He was a powerhouse, a veteran woodsman who was fit and strong. Then there was Constable George Kinney. He was not as tough as Taylor, but he was reliable. Finally, there was Special Constable Sam Carter. Carter was an expert herdsman and a longtime resident of the North. So, you have 4 tough, experienced men. They had the best dogs. They had the best equipment. They were the dream team of the Arctic. But right before they left, there was a red flag. A massive red flag. A local indigenous guide offered to go with them. The route from Fort McPherson to Dawson City is tricky. There are hundreds of rivers and creeks that all look exactly the same. If you take one wrong turn, you end up in a dead end. Fitzgerald looked at the guide and shook his head. He said, "No thanks. I have a map, I have a compass, and I have Sam Carter. He knows the way." Fitzgerald was so confident in his ability to move fast that he made a critical calculation. He decided to travel light. He packed enough food for 30 days. The trip usually took roughly 30 to 40 days. He was cutting it razor thin because he assumed they would be flying across the snow. On December 21st, 1910, the 4 men and their 3 teams of 15 dogs set off from Fort McPherson. The temperature was a brisk 21 degrees below zero. The villagers waved goodbye, watching the lost patrol disappear into the white horizon. They expected to hear news of their record-breaking arrival in Dawson City in a few weeks. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The team was making incredible time. They were covering 20 miles a day. They laughed, they joked, and they camped under the northern lights. Fitzgerald felt validated. He didn't need a guide. He was the master of the North. But on New Year's Day, 1911, the luck ran out. A massive snowstorm hit. The trail, which was usually visible, was buried under feet of fresh powder. The landmarks were erased. Fitzgerald began to rely heavily on Sam Carter to navigate. But there was a problem. Sam Carter had only done this route once before, and it was 5 years ago, and he had done it in the opposite direction. The terrain started to look unfamiliar. They were searching for a specific river called the Little Wind River. It was the key to crossing the mountain range. Sam Carter looked at a frozen creek and said, "This is it. This is the turn." Fitzgerald checked his map. It didn't look quite right, but he trusted his man. He trusted the experience. So the patrol turned right, heading up a steep, winding canyon. They traveled for days up this river. The going got harder. The snow got deeper. The dogs were struggling. Finally, after wasting nearly a week fighting their way up this canyon, the river just ended. It fizzled out into a dense forest of willow and jagged rocks. It was a dead end. They had taken the wrong turn. Fitzgerald stood there, looking at the dead end, and the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. They had wasted precious food and precious energy going the wrong way. He checked the supplies. They had enough food left for maybe a week or two, but they were only halfway to Dawson City. Fitzgerald made the only decision he could. He said, "We have to turn back. We have to go back to Fort McPherson." It was January 12th, 1911. The return trip should have been easy. Just follow their own tracks back, right? Wrong. The wind in the Arctic is relentless. Their tracks from the journey up the canyon had been completely blown away. They were breaking a fresh trail all over again. And now, the temperature dropped. We are talking about 50 degrees below zero. At that temperature, the air hurts to breathe. Your eyelashes freeze together, and they were running out of food. This is where the story shifts from an adventure to a horror movie. By mid-January, the dog food was gone. The dogs, which had been their loyal engines, were now starving. They became weak. And in the Arctic, when a sled dog can no longer pull, it becomes something else. It becomes food. Fitzgerald ordered the first dog to be killed. The men sat around the campfire, cooking the meat of the animal that had pulled them for hundreds of miles. It was a grim meal. Dog meat is tough, stringy, and has very little fat. In the cold, your body needs fat to burn for heat. Lean meat doesn't cut it. You can eat a full belly of lean meat and still starve to death. It is called rabbit starvation. As they trudged back toward Fort McPherson, the men began to deteriorate. Their faces grew gaunt. Their movements became slow and jerky. Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter were hit the hardest. They started to hallucinate. They complained of pains in their feet. Frostbite was setting in. Their toes were turning black. By the end of January, they were still hundreds of miles from safety. They were now killing a dog every few days just to stay alive. But there is a dark science to eating sled dogs. The liver of a dog, especially one that has been working hard in the Arctic, can be toxic to humans. It contains dangerous levels of vitamin A. But the men were so hungry, so desperate for anything that tasted like food, that they ate the livers too. This likely made them sick, causing their skin to peel and their heads to throb, adding to the misery. On February 5th, the group reached a breaking point. They were back at the river where they had made the wrong turn. But they were broken men. Taylor and Carter could barely walk. They were stumbling, falling, and crying out in pain. Fitzgerald looked at his team. He knew that if they stayed together, they would all die. Taylor and Carter were moving too slow. So, Fitzgerald made a desperate gamble. He decided to leave the two sick men behind with a small amount of equipment and camp. He and Constable Kinney, who was still somewhat mobile, would make a mad dash for Fort McPherson. They would run, get help, and send a rescue team back for the others. It was a noble plan, but it was a doomed plan. Fitzgerald and Kinney left their friends. They took the strongest remaining dogs and started running. But running is a strong word. They were shuffling. They were skeletons in parkas. A few days after they split up, Fitzgerald and Kinney realized they weren't going to make it. They were too weak. The snow was too deep. And then something truly heartbreaking happened. They realized that Taylor and Carter, the men they had left behind, had not stayed in camp. In a delirium of fear and madness, the two sick men had tried to follow them. Fitzgerald and Kinney stopped. They waited. Eventually, the two groups merged again. But now, nobody had any strength left. The dogs were all gone. They had eaten every single one. They were boiling the leather harnesses and the rawhide straps of their snowshoes to drink the broth, just to get the taste of something organic in their mouths. On February 12, 1911, the diary of Inspector Fitzgerald goes silent. Back at Fort McPherson, the weeks had ticked by. People were getting worried. The lost patrol should have been back, or a message should have arrived from Dawson City saying they made it. But the telegraph line was silent. A corporal named William Dempster, a man who respected Fitzgerald but knew the dangers of the land, decided to launch a rescue mission. He gathered a team of indigenous trackers and set out to find the lost legends. Dempster moved fast. He followed the trail. He found the abandoned campsites, and at each campsite, he found evidence of the horror. He found dog paws severed and left in the snow. He found harnesses cut up and chewed on. On March 21st, 1911, 3 months after the patrol had left, Corporal Dempster was traveling down the Peel River, just about 25 miles from Fort McPherson. 25 miles. That is one long day of hiking. They were so close. Dempster saw something in the distance. It was a blue handkerchief tied to a tree branch, fluttering in the wind. He approached it slowly. Beneath the tree, buried under a layer of fresh snow, were two shapes. Dempster brushed the snow away. It was Constable Taylor and Special Constable Carter. They were lying side by side. They were emaciated beyond recognition. Their faces were skeletal. Carter's hands were folded over his chest. Taylor had evidently died first, and Carter, in his final moments, had tried to cover his friend with a sleeping bag before lying down to die himself. But where were Fitzgerald and Kinney? Dempster and his team continued searching. They found tracks leading away from the bodies. Fitzgerald and Kinney had tried one last, desperate push. They had left their dead friends to try and crawl the last 25 miles. About 10 miles further down the river, Dempster found a makeshift campsite. There was a kettle sitting on the remains of a fire that had burned out weeks ago. Inside the kettle was half-cooked piece of moose skin, part of their boots. And lying next to the fire were the bodies of Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and Constable George Kinney. Fitzgerald was lying on his back. Even in death, he looked like he was trying to maintain some dignity. But the scene was horrific. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Dempster searched Fitzgerald's pockets. He found a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper. On it, Fitzgerald had written his last will and testament. It was a message to his wife. The note was shaky, written by a hand that was freezing to death. It read, "All money, watch, map, and furs is left to my beloved wife, Leela, and daughter. God bless you." And then, underneath that, a final line that summed up the entire tragedy. A confession from the man who never failed, the man who thought he could beat the North. He wrote, "My last hope is gone." The discovery of the lost patrol shocked the world. It was front-page news in London, New York, and Ottawa. How could the best of the best die like this? An inquiry was held. They analyzed every decision Fitzgerald made. They concluded that it was a combination of bad luck, bad weather, and one fatal flaw: hubris. Fitzgerald wanted the speed record so badly that he refused a guide. He wanted to travel so light that he didn't bring enough food for an emergency. He trusted his own legend more than he trusted the reality of the landscape. When the bodies were examined, it was determined that they had died of starvation and exposure. But the psychological torture they endured, the realization that they had taken a wrong turn, the eating of the dogs, the slow march toward a home they would never see is unimaginable. They were buried in Fort McPherson. Their graves are still there today, 4 white picket fences in a row, marking the resting place of the lost patrol. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police changed their rules after this. They made it mandatory to hire indigenous guides for long patrols. They established food caches along the route so that no one would ever starve again. But the lesson of Inspector Fitzgerald remains. The Arctic is a place of absolute truth. It does not care about your rank. It does not care about your past victories. It does not care if you are a hero. If you take a wrong turn and you are not prepared, the wind will bury you just the same. So, the next time you are planning a trip and you think you don't need a map because you have a good sense of direction, just remember the lost patrol. Remember the blue handkerchief tied to a tree just 20 miles from safety. And remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is admit that you need help. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a strange, dark, and mysterious day, because today we are venturing out onto the relentless, churning waters of the North Atlantic. This is a story about the terrifying finality of the sea, the perfect erasure of a human life, and a disappearance so clean, so absolute, that it defied all logic and left behind only the chilling riddle of an empty boat. This is the story of the unsolvable case of the missing fisherman. Before we dive into the deep end of the mysterious, do me a favor. If you enjoy this type of content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching this video from. Your support helps me keep telling these strange, dark, and mysterious stories. Our story begins in the small, tight-knit fishing village of Port Blossom, nestled on the rocky coast of Maine in the late 1970s. This community was built on the sea, and its people respected its power. They knew that the ocean takes its due. Our protagonist is a fisherman named Silas Croft. Silas was a 30-year-old man, known as one of the most capable and cautious lobster fishermen in Port Blossom. He was strong, steady, and meticulous about safety. Silas owned his own boat, the Sea Witch, a sturdy 26-foot diesel trawler. On a crisp, clear Monday morning in mid-October, Silas kissed his wife goodbye, gave his customary wave to the dockmaster, and took the Sea Witch out to his favorite lobster grounds about 15 miles offshore. He was expected back by sunset around 6 o'clock p.m. I'm Brad. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, minimal chop, and the kind of ideal conditions that promise a heavy haul. 6 o'clock p.m. came and went. Silas did not return. By 9 p.m., the Coast Guard was notified and a search was immediately launched. The search was aided by the excellent weather and the clear fact that Silas had not been out long enough to drift far. The discovery was made at 3 a.m., floating gently in the quiet water just 5 miles east of his regular fishing spot. It was the Sea Witch. The boat was found completely adrift. But the scene was not one of wreckage or disaster. It was one of impossible, unsettling stillness. The Sea Witch was in perfect working order. The engine was off, but the starter was not engaged. The hull was undamaged. The bilge was dry. The boat was simply floating, untouched by the sea's violence. The Coast Guard team, led by a seasoned officer named Lieutenant Commander Harrison, climbed aboard. What they found inside immediately turned the case from a standard missing person report into a baffling maritime mystery. The evidence aboard the Sea Witch, the gear. The lobster pots, all 10 of them, were stacked neatly on the aft deck, ready to be deployed. The coils of heavy rope were organized and tied down, just as Silas had left them. The cabin. The tiny cabin was clean and undisturbed. His rain slicker was hanging on a hook, and his lunch, a thermos of coffee and a half-eaten sandwich, was sitting on the navigation table. The safety equipment, the flares, life jackets, and emergency radio were all exactly where they should have been. Nothing had been used. The unsettling detail. The boat's wheel was secured. Silas had tied the wheel off with a short length of sturdy half-inch nylon rope, fixing the rudder in a straight, neutral position. This was a common practice only when a fisherman intended to leave the helm for a brief, routine moment like making a sandwich or checking a bilge pump. It was clear Silas had stopped the boat, secured the wheel, and stepped away from the helm for what he thought would be a moment. But the most damning piece of evidence was found right in the center of the deck, near the sorting table. Lying on the wet wood was Silas's knife. It was his favorite tool, a heavy 9-inch carbon steel fillet knife, its blade razor sharp. Silas was meticulous. He never left that knife lying loose on the deck. It was always secured in its sheath on his hip. And resting beside the knife, pinned beneath the heavy blade, was a small 3x5-inch scrap of paper. Commander Harrison carefully lifted the knife and unfolded the paper. It was a note, written hastily in Silas's own hand, clearly legible despite the dew. The note contained only 3 words. It is too quiet. The unsolvable mystery. The search for Silas Croft became an intense, massive operation, spanning hundreds of square miles of the North Atlantic. They searched for a body, for a life jacket, for any sign of a struggle. The sea gave up nothing. The physical evidence pointed to an impossible conclusion. Silas Croft had stopped his boat, secured his wheel, placed his knife and a note on the deck, and then, in a perfectly calm, non-emergency situation, walked off the side of his boat and vanished without a trace. The Coast Guard, unable to rationalize the event, suggested that Silas must have suffered a sudden, acute psychological break, written the note, and committed suicide. The people of Port Blossom, however, rejected this idea completely. Silas was not a depressed man. His note, "It is too quiet," was not a cry of despair. It was a cryptic professional observation. The fishermen knew what that phrase meant. The ocean, even on a calm day, is never truly silent. There is always the rush of the wind, the cry of gulls, the slap of the water, the whine of the engine, the distant drone of ships. When the ocean becomes too quiet, it means the natural background noise has stopped, and it is replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. Silas had experienced a localized atmospheric or oceanic anomaly, a pocket of silence that was so profound it compelled him to stop his work. But why would he leave his knife and write a note? The only person who provided a clue was Silas's wife, who confessed that Silas had recently developed an odd habit. Before every trip, he would take his knife, tap the deck 3 times, and repeat a small, strange phrase he refused to explain. "Don't take the sound." A private investigator hired by the family focused on the only truly abnormal physical evidence, the 3-word note and the secured wheel. He believed that Silas had heard something in the silence that demanded his attention. He theorized that Silas had anchored his boat not to have lunch, but to get a better look at something floating nearby, something he didn't want to lose track of. But if he was going to look, why wouldn't he take his binoculars? Why leave the knife? The case went cold, haunting Port Blossom for decades. The Sea Witch was eventually salvaged, but the question of what happened to its captain remained unanswered. The second incident. The mystery reignited exactly 10 years later, in October 1988. Another fisherman from Port Blossom, a man named George Harper, was fishing in the exact same spot where the sea witch was found. The weather was again unnaturally calm. George returned to Port Blossom that evening, visibly shaken. He stumbled off his boat and immediately went to the Coast Guard station, where he demanded to speak only to Commander Harrison, who was still serving in the area. George recounted a terrifying experience. He had been pulling in his lobster traps when the engine on his boat suddenly stalled, despite being brand new and flawlessly maintained. He tried to restart it, but the ignition was dead. The moment the engine died, the silence descended. "It wasn't just quiet, Commander," George whispered to Harrison. "The air felt thick, heavy. The gulls stopped flying. The water, it stopped moving. It was like I was floating in a tank of glass." George, terrified, grabbed his radio to call for help. Just as he lifted the microphone, he heard a sound, a slow, rhythmic thump that seemed to emanate not from the water, but from the bottom of his hull. Thump, thump, thump. He described the sound as being huge, like a deep heartbeat. George said he felt an overwhelming, irresistible urge to look over the side of the boat. He walked to the stern, resisting the urge to open his mouth or make any noise. As he reached the railing, the rhythmic thumping stopped. In its place, George heard a whisper, faint and dry, that seemed to come from the deep water directly beneath him. The whisper spoke a single complete sentence. "The sound is needed now." George was paralyzed with terror. He dropped to the deck and crawled back to his cabin, where he found his rifle. He sat there, pointing the rifle at the water for 2 hours, until, suddenly, the silence broke. The gulls cried, the water lapped, and the engine on his boat suddenly roared back to life without him touching the ignition. He raced back to shore. He explained that Silas Croft hadn't committed suicide, nor had he been the victim of a random event. Silas had encountered an entity in that patch of ocean, something ancient and sentient that required silence to reveal itself, and demanded sound as a form of payment or tribute. George theorized that Silas, a man who knew the rules of the sea, had heard the call in the silence. He anchored the wheel and placed his knife down as a mark of respect and neutrality. Then, he went over the side, not to commit suicide, but to investigate the unearthly silence, thinking his silence would protect him. But the note, "It is too quiet," was the last noise he ever made. It was his final, fatal mistake, a word spoken, a sound made, which was immediately taken by whatever lay beneath the still water. Commander Harrison was skeptical, but the sheer terror in George's eyes was undeniable. He filed the report, classifying the event as an isolated anomaly. But George Harper quit fishing that day. He moved inland and never spoke of the sea again. He left Port Blossom knowing that in that particular stretch of the North Atlantic, the rules of physics and biology do not apply. If you stop your boat and the world falls silent, you have to be perfectly still, because the quiet entity is listening, and if you give it any sound, a word, a sigh, or the small thump of a body hitting the water, it will take the sound, and you, forever. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strange, dark, and mysterious story of the unsolvable case of the missing fisherman. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Today's story is about a night of celebration that turned into a scene of absolute, incomprehensible horror. It happened on a night when the whole world was looking forward to a fresh start, only to find that for some, the clock would stop exactly at midnight. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. The city of Seattle, Washington, is known for many things: the Space Needle, the rain, and a very vibrant underground art scene. By the time December 31st, 2023 rolled around, everyone in the city was looking for the IT Party. And that year, the IT Party was being held at a place called the Iron Foundry. The Iron Foundry was a massive, converted industrial warehouse located right on the edge of the Elliott Bay waterfront. It had been built back in 1924, and for decades it was used to forge heavy machinery for the shipping industry. But by 2023, it had been hollowed out and turned into a premier event space. It had these towering 40-foot ceilings, exposed brick walls, and massive steel rafters that still had the original rust-colored chains hanging from them. It was the perfect industrial chic vibe. Enter a man named Elias. Elias was a 27-year-old freelance photographer who had spent the last 3 years trying to make a name for himself. He was talented, but in a city like Seattle, the competition was fierce. When he landed a gig to be the lead photographer for the Iron Foundry's Century Gala, a massive New Year's Eve bash celebrating the building's 100th year, he knew this was his big break. On the evening of December 31st, 2023, Elias arrived at the foundry around 8 o'clock in the evening. The air outside was biting cold, somewhere around 32 degrees, and the wind coming off the water felt like 1,000 tiny needles hitting your face. But inside, the foundry was glowing. They had strung up over 5,000 individual fairy lights across the rafters, and there was a massive crystal chandelier hanging right in the center of the dance floor. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the guests started pouring in. We're talking about 600 people, all dressed in tuxedos and floor-length gowns. There was an open bar, a live jazz band, and the atmosphere was electric. Elias was everywhere, snapping photos of local celebrities, tech moguls, and socialites. He noticed that the floor, which was made of heavy, polished timber planks, felt incredibly solid under his feet. It had to be. It was designed to hold the weight of literal tons of iron back in the 1920s. However, as the night went on, Elias started to notice something a bit off. Around 10:30 in the evening, he was standing near the back of the room by the service entrance, changing the battery in his camera. As he leaned against one of the massive brick pillars, he felt a vibration. Now, in a party with 600 people dancing, you expect the floor to shake a little. But this wasn't a rhythmic vibration from the music. It was a low, grinding shudder that seemed to come from deep beneath the building. It lasted for about 4 seconds and then stopped. Elias looked around, but nobody else seemed to notice. The music was too loud, the laughter too high. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a large ship docking at the pier next door. But then, at 11:15 in the evening, it happened again. This time, it was louder. A sharp crack echoed through the room, sounding like a gunshot. A few people on the dance floor stopped and looked around, confused. The band stumbled for a second, but the lead singer made a joke about the building reaching its 100th birthday, and everyone laughed and went back to their drinks. Elias, though, wasn't laughing. Being a photographer, he had a very keen eye for detail. He walked over to the spot where he thought the sound had come from a section of the floor near the VIP lounge. He knelt down, pretending to adjust his camera bag, and looked at the timber planks. There was a gap. A gap about 2 inches wide had opened up between two of the massive beams, and when he leaned in closer, he didn't see the concrete subfloor he expected to see. He saw nothing. Just a pitch-black void. And from that void, he could smell the salt of the ocean and the rank odor of rotting wood. He realized in that moment that this part of the foundry wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on an old pier system, wooden pilings driven into the mud of the bay a century ago. Elias found the event coordinator, a woman named Sarah, who was frantically checking her watch. He pulled her aside and said, "Sarah, I think there's something wrong with the floor. There's a structural gap opening up near the VIP section." Sarah looked at him like he had two heads. "Elias," she said, "it's 11:45 in the evening. We have 15 minutes until the biggest countdown in the city. The building has been here for 100 years. It's fine. Just keep taking pictures." Elias tried to protest, but Sarah had already disappeared into the crowd. Elias stood there, heart racing. He looked at the 600 people in the room. They were all moving toward the center of the floor for the big countdown. 600 people, all concentrated in one single area. If you do the math and assume the average person weighs 160 pounds, that is 96,000 pounds of human weight concentrated on a floor that was currently groaning. At 11:55 in the evening, the energy hit a fever pitch. The band stopped playing, and a giant digital clock projected onto the brick wall began the final 5-minute count. Elias felt a sense of impending doom. He didn't want to be that guy who ruined New Year's, but his gut was screaming at him. He moved toward the exit, pushing through the crowd. He got to the heavy steel doors and stepped out onto the loading dock into the freezing night air. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. He told himself he was being paranoid. Inside, he could hear the crowd starting the final count. 10, Elias looked through the glass window of the door. He saw the sea of happy faces, their glasses raised. 9. He saw Sarah, the coordinator, smiling and holding a bottle of champagne. 8. The grinding sound returned, but this time it didn't stop. It was a continuous, deafening roar of wood splintering. 7. Elias saw the massive crystal chandelier in the center of the room begin to sway. Not just a little bit, but a violent, swinging motion. 6. The projector on the wall flickered. The brickwork began to shower dust down onto the guests. 5. Suddenly, the music cut out. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, except for the glowing red numbers of the countdown clock. 4. In the dim red light, Elias saw the center of the dance floor simply vanish. There was no slow creak. It was an instantaneous, catastrophic failure. The timber planks snapped like toothpicks. 1 second, there were hundreds of people jumping and cheering, and the next, there was only a gaping hole. 3. The screams started. But they weren't the screams of a party. They were the sounds of pure, unadulterated terror. Because the foundry was built over the water, those people weren't falling onto a basement floor. They were falling 20 feet down into the freezing, black, 45-degree waters of Elliott Bay, trapped under the weight of the very timber and steel that was supposed to protect them. 2. Elias watched in horror as the rest of the floor began to unzip. The structural failure was cascading. The massive steel pillars that held up the roof were losing their footing. One of the pillars shifted, and the roof above the dance floor began to cave in. 1. The countdown clock hit 0. The Happy New Year banner, which was rigged to drop from the ceiling, fell into the abyss. But there was no cheering. There was only the sound of rushing water and the groans of dying machinery. Elias didn't wait. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered almost immediately. 911. What is your emergency? Elias was hyperventilating. The Iron Foundry, Pier 54. The floor collapsed. Hundreds of people are in the water. You need everybody. Police, fire, Coast Guard, now. As he stood on that loading dock, Elias could hear the people below. The water in the bay was so cold that cold shock response would set in within seconds. When you hit water that cold, your body's natural instinct is to gasp. If your head is underwater when you gasp, you drown instantly. If you stay afloat, you have maybe 10 minutes before your limbs stop working. Within 5 minutes, the first sirens could be heard. Seattle Fire Department arrived with 4 engines and 2 ladder trucks, but when they looked inside the building, they realized the situation was even worse than reported. The collapse had severed the main gas line. One of the firefighters, a veteran named Miller who had been on the force for 22 years, later said it was the most haunting thing he'd ever seen. He stood at the edge of the jagged floor, shining a high-powered flashlight down into the hole. He could see dozens of people clinging to floating pieces of timber. He saw the sequins of evening gowns shimmering in the dark water. But then, he smelled the gas. "Everyone out!" Miller shouted. "No sparks! No lights! Get out now!" But it was too late. Somewhere in the wreckage, a severed electrical wire sparked. The explosion didn't level the building, but it sent a fireball through the upper rafters, causing the remaining part of the roof, the part that hadn't collapsed, to come crashing down. This created a pancake effect. The heavy roof debris fell onto the floor, which then fell onto the people already struggling in the water below. By 2 o'clock in the morning on January 1st, 2024, the scene was a nightmare. The Coast Guard had sent 3 boats to circle the pier, pulling anyone they could find out of the water. Divers were sent down into the dark, debris-filled bay, but the visibility was 0. They had to feel their way through a forest of jagged wood and twisted metal. Elias stayed there the whole night. He sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket. He watched as they brought the survivors out. Some were blue from the cold, shivering so hard they couldn't speak. Others were silent, staring off into nothing. Then, they started bringing out the black bags. The final tally was staggering. Out of the 600 people at the gala, 112 did not make it through the night. 48 had drowned in the initial collapse, and the rest were lost to the explosion or the hypothermia that followed. But here is where the story gets truly strange. When the investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board and structural engineers began their sweep of the wreckage on January 2nd, 2024, they found something that made no sense. They were looking at the main support pilings, the giant wooden poles that go from the building down into the seabed. These pilings are usually treated with creosote to prevent rot and are inspected every 5 years. According to the city records, the iron foundry had passed its inspection in 2021. However, when they pulled one of the central pilings out of the mud, they saw that it hadn't just rotted. It looked like it had been eaten, but not by a natural organism. There were perfectly circular holes, exactly 3 inches in diameter, bored straight through the center of the 12-inch thick oak pilings. The engineers counted over 200 of these holes across the entire support system. It looked like the building had been standing on Swiss cheese. When they analyzed the interior of the holes, they found traces of a high alkaline chemical compound that shouldn't exist in the Puget Sound. It was a substance that practically dissolved organic matter on contact. The investigation went on for months. They looked into the owners of the building, the inspection company, and even local shipping companies to see if there had been a chemical spill, but they found nothing. No records of that chemical being sold or transported in the state of Washington. Then, an anonymous whistleblower from the city's archives department sent a package to the local news. Inside was a set of blueprints for the iron foundry dating back to 1924. On the original blueprints, there was a handwritten note in the margins of the foundation page. It said, "Do not build over the salt well. The ground here does not belong to the city." The salt well was a local legend from the 1800s. The indigenous tribes of the area had warned the early settlers that there was a specific spot on the waterfront where the water ate the wood. They believed it was a vent to something much deeper, something that didn't like being covered up. The developers in 1924 had ignored the warning. They built the foundry anyway, and for 99 years, it held. But on that 100th year, during the loudest, heaviest moment in the building's history, whatever was down there finally finished what it started. Elias eventually moved away from Seattle. He stopped taking photos of parties. In fact, he stopped taking photos of people altogether. He moved to the desert in Arizona, as far away from the ocean as he could get. He still has his camera from that night. He never cleared the memory card. On that card, there is one final photo he took at exactly 11:59 and 59 seconds. It was a long exposure shot aimed at the dance floor right as the lights flickered. In the photo, because of the blur, you can see the people falling. But if you look at the very bottom of the frame, in the dark void where the floor used to be, you can see something else. It's not a piling, and it's not a piece of debris. It looks like a series of hundreds of pale, thin, elongated arms reaching up out of the black water, catching the guests before they even hit the surface. And that is why Elias doesn't go near the water anymore, because he knows that while the world was shouting Happy New Year, something else was finally getting its invitation to the party. Today's story is about a man whose desire to change his life for the better led him directly into a situation that was so terrifying it defies logical explanation. It is a story about how a simple promise made at the stroke of midnight can turn into a desperate fight for survival in the most claustrophobic environment imaginable. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. The story begins with a man named David Miller. David was a 34-year-old accountant living in a quiet suburb just outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. David was, by all accounts, a very safe person. He followed the rules, he never took risks, and his life was a predictable loop of spreadsheets, microwave dinners, and late-night television. But as December 31st, 2023 approached, David felt a profound sense of emptiness. He realized that he had spent his entire 20s and early 30s being afraid of the world. He was tired of being the man who said no to every adventure. So, when the clock struck 12 on January 1st, 2024, David made a resolution. He sat in his dark living room, listening to the distant sounds of fireworks, and he whispered to himself, This is the year of no fear. He decided that every single weekend of 2024, he would do something that scared him. He called it his hardship resolution. For his very first challenge on that cold New Year's Day, David decided to go hiking. But not just a normal hike on a paved trail. He had heard rumors of an abandoned iron mine located deep within the Blackwood Ridge Forest, about a 45-minute drive from his house. This mine, known as the Whispering Shaft, had been closed since 1892 after a series of unexplained disappearances among the miners. Local legend said the mine wasn't just deep, it was wrong. But David, fueled by his new resolution, pushed those thoughts aside. On the morning of January 1st, 2024, David packed his gear. He was inexperienced, but he was prepared. He brought 3 different flashlights, extra batteries, a heavy-duty rope, a first aid kit, and enough water for 2 days. The temperature outside was a biting 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light dusting of snow covered the ground as he pulled his silver SUV into the trailhead parking lot. He began his hike at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The woods were silent. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling the dead leaves, just the rhythmic crunch of David's boots on the frozen earth. After hiking for about 3 miles, using an old topographical map he had found on an internet forum, he saw it. Tucked behind a thicket of overgrown hemlock trees was the entrance to the Whispering Shaft. It didn't look like much, just a jagged 4-foot-wide hole in the side of a granite cliff, reinforced by rotting timber beams that looked like they were one sneeze away from collapsing. A rusted iron sign hung crookedly above the entrance, its letters faded, but you could still make out the warning. Danger. Unauthorized entry prohibited. David stood there for a long time. His heart was hammering against his ribs at 120 beats per minute. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around, go home, and watch football. But then he remembered his resolution. He clicked on his primary headlamp, a powerful 2,000 lumen LED, and stepped into the darkness. The air inside the mine was instantly different. It was heavy, damp, and smelled of wet earth and something metallic, like old pennies. As David moved deeper, the tunnel began to narrow. He had to crouch, his 6-foot 2-inch frame feeling more and more cramped. By the time he was about 500 feet into the mountain, the ceiling had dropped to only 3 feet. He was now on his hands and knees, crawling over sharp rocks and cold mud. He checked his watch. It was 10:30 in the morning. He told himself he would go for another 30 minutes and then turn back. But as he rounded a sharp bend, his light hit something incredible. The tunnel opened up into a massive natural cavern that the miners had stumbled upon over 100 years ago. It was beautiful. Huge white stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen teeth, and the walls sparkled with quartz. David stood up, stretching his aching back. He felt a surge of adrenaline. I did it, he thought. I'm actually doing it. He began to explore the perimeter of the cavern. In the far corner, he noticed a vertical shaft that dropped down into total darkness. Beside it was an old wooden ladder, surprisingly intact. David walked over and peered down. He couldn't see the bottom. He picked up a small stone and dropped it. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, before he heard a faint clink far below. It was deep, maybe 60 or 70 feet. Against his better judgment, David decided he wanted to see what was down there. He tied his rope to a sturdy-looking timber support beam, checked his harness twice, and began to rappel down the shaft. The descent was slow. Every time he moved, the old wood above him groaned, sending little showers of dust down his neck. When he reached the bottom, his feet touched a floor of soft, black sand. He shined his light around and realized he was in a much smaller, perfectly circular room. But as he panned his light across the walls, his blood ran cold. The walls weren't made of rock. They were covered in thousands of small, hand-carved wooden dolls, all pinned to the earth with rusted iron nails. Each doll was dressed in tiny, rotting scraps of 19th century clothing. David backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't mining. This was something else. He reached for his rope to start climbing back up, but as he put his weight on it, he heard a sickening crack from above. The timber beam he had tied the rope to, the one that had stood for over 130 years, finally gave way. In an instant, the rope went slack. David fell backward into the black sand as the heavy beam and a cascade of rocks came thundering down the shaft. A cloud of thick, choking dust filled the small room. David scrambled into a corner, shielding his head as the debris settled. When the silence returned, it was absolute. David flicked on his light, which had been knocked off his head. The shaft was gone. The collapse had completely plugged the hole with tons of granite and splintered wood. He was buried 60 feet underground in a room filled with thousands of staring dolls. He scrambled to the pile of rubble and began to dig frantically with his bare hands. He clawed at the rocks until his fingernails bled, but for every stone he moved, 3 more slid down to take its place. He was trapped. David sat back, trying to force himself to stay calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. 0 bars. No service. He was 60 feet under solid rock. He knew there was no way a signal could get out, but he tried anyway. He dialed 911. The screen just blinked. Emergency calls only. Searching for network. He tried again. 911. Nothing. Someone will come for me, he whispered. But then he remembered he hadn't told anyone where he was going. He wanted his resolution to be a surprise. No one knew he was at Blackwood Ridge. He checked his supplies. He had 2 liters of water and 3 granola bars. He had his flashlights, but he knew the batteries wouldn't last forever. He turned off his headlamp to save power, plunging himself into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight on his skin. And that's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. But then, it became clearer. It was a rhythmic, wet, sliding sound. Shh, slip. Shh, shh, shh. It was coming from the other side of the room near the wall of dolls. David froze. He didn't want to turn on the light. He was terrified of what he might see. But the sound was getting closer. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the sand. Then, a new sound joined it, a high-pitched, metallic scratching, like a rusted nail being pulled across a chalkboard. David's hand trembled as he gripped his flashlight. He clicked it on and swung the beam toward the sound. The wall of dolls was different. Some of the dolls were missing. In their place were small, pale indentations in the dirt. And there, in the center of his light, was a hole in the floor that hadn't been there before. It was a narrow, jagged burrow, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. From that hole, a hand emerged. But it wasn't a human hand. It was too long, with 4 extra joints in each finger, and the skin was the color of a dead fish, translucent and glistening with slime. The fingers reached out and gripped the edge of the black sand, pulling a long, distorted torso out of the earth. David let out a scream that tore through his throat. He scrambled backward, hitting the rock wall. The creature didn't have eyes. Where its eyes should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. But it had a mouth, a wide, lipless, horizontal slit filled with hundreds of needle-like teeth. The creature turned its head toward David, its nostrils flaring as it caught his scent. It let out a sound that David would later describe as a wet whistle. David grabbed the only weapon he had, his heavy metal maglite. As the creature lunged at him with impossible speed, David swung. The flashlight connected with the side of the creature's head with a dull thud. The thing shrieked and recoiled, disappearing back into the burrow with a flurry of movement. David didn't wait. He knew he couldn't stay in that room. He looked at the pile of rubble from the collapse. Near the top, he saw a tiny gap between 2 large boulders where a faint draft of air was blowing through. It was tiny, maybe 10 inches wide. He began to climb. He shoved his body into the crevice, the sharp rocks tearing through his jacket and skin. He didn't care about the pain. He could hear the whistling sound returning from the hole below. He pushed and squeezed, his chest compressed so tightly he could barely breathe. He was halfway through the gap when his foot got stuck. He kicked wildly, feeling those long, multi-jointed fingers brush against the sole of his boot. He let out one final agonizing heave and popped through the gap into a narrow, secondary tunnel he hadn't seen before. He crawled for what felt like miles. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move away from the whistling. Eventually, the tunnel began to slope upward. The air became colder, fresher. After 3 hours of crawling through the dark, David saw a glimmer of gray light. He scrambled toward it, pushing through a final pile of loose shale and tumbled out into the snow. He was nearly a mile away from the main entrance of the mine, emerging from a natural vent on the other side of the ridge. He collapsed into the snow, sobbing, his body covered in blood, mud, and black sand. He checked his pocket. His phone was cracked, but it was on. He looked at the screen. 1 bar. He dialed 911. This time, a voice answered. 911. What is your emergency? David could barely speak. My name is David Miller. I'm at Blackwood Ridge. Please, there's something in the mine. There's something in the mountain. The police and search and rescue teams arrived 40 minutes later. They found David huddled under a tree, suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. They took him to the nearest hospital, where he spent the next 2 weeks recovering from his injuries. When David told the authorities about the room with the dolls and the creature, they sent a tactical recovery team into the Whispering Shaft. But when they got to the cavern, they found that the entire shaft had suffered a secondary collapse. The room David described was gone. Buried under hundreds of tons of solid rock, there was no way to verify his story. However, the lead investigator found something strange. On the edge of the collapsed area, lying in the dirt, was David's primary headlamp. It had been crushed. But that wasn't the weird part. The investigator noticed that the metal casing of the lamp had dozens of tiny, deep gouges in it, marks that looked exactly like they had been made by hundreds of needle-thin teeth. David Miller never made another New Year's resolution. He moved to a high-rise apartment in the city, a place with bright lights, concrete floors, and no crawl spaces. He still doesn't like the dark, and he never, ever goes hiking. Because every time he closes his eyes, he doesn't see the spreadsheets or his old life. He sees those long, pale fingers, and he hears that wet whistling sound coming from just beneath the floorboards. And that is going to do it for today's story. If you enjoyed this tale of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please let us know. We will see you in the next one.